On September 18, 1998, the first dump truck rolled through the gates of Carter Family Farms, just outside Frostproof, Polk County, Florida, before the morning fog had lifted from the banana grove. Emma Carter had been awake for nearly an hour. At 24 years old, she already understood the language of old machinery better than most mechanics. She could tell whether her father's 1968 John Deere 3020 needed fuel, oil, or simply a patient hand, just by listening to the first few seconds of its engine. The tractor had worked the farm for 3 decades. Her father bought it used in 1974 for $6,800, and before he passed away the previous winter, he always said the tractor had one rule: take care of it, and it'll take care of you. Emma still repeated those words every morning as she wiped dust from the faded green hood. She expected to spend that Friday repairing irrigation lines damaged by summer storms. Instead, she watched a convoy of dump trucks turn onto her dirt road. One, then another, then another. By the time she counted 12, she knew something was terribly wrong. The lead driver climbed down holding a clipboard. "You Emma Carter?" She nodded. "Delivery order." "I didn't order anything." The man looked uncomfortable. "I'm just paid to drive." He climbed back into the cab. Seconds later, the truck bed lifted. A black wave of rotting bananas crashed onto the edge of her lower field. The smell arrived before the pile stopped moving. Sweet, sour, fermented, overpowering. Emma stood frozen. Another truck pulled forward. Its bed lifted too. Then another. For the next 6 hours, truck after truck emptied its load onto her property. Workers barely looked at her. By late afternoon, nearly 900 tons of spoiled bananas formed a mountain stretching across almost 4 acres. Thick brown liquid seeped through the sandy soil toward the drainage ditch. Swarms of flies gathered so quickly the air itself seemed to vibrate. Neighbors stopped along County Road 630. Nobody knew what to say. Some simply shook their heads. Others whispered that the farm was finished. Emma didn't cry. She just stared. Let me tell you about Emma Carter. She wasn't born wanting to become a farmer. She had studied business at a community college in Winter Haven and dreamed of opening a small nursery one day. Then, in January 1998, her father suffered a fatal heart attack while repairing a water pump. The farm became hers overnight. Most people expected her to sell it. The mortgage wasn't small. Banana prices had fallen. Developers were already buying farmland across Polk County for warehouses and housing projects. Selling would have been the easy decision. Emma chose the harder one. She believed land deserved at least one honest fight before someone gave up on it. That decision attracted attention, especially from Sunstate Fruit Processing, a company expanding its nearby packing operation. Their engineers wanted Emma's property because it bordered the only practical access road for new transport trucks. They offered to buy the farm twice. She refused twice. After that, negotiations stopped, or so she believed. Late that afternoon, a white company pickup eased onto the shoulder beside the banana pile. Out stepped Richard Coleman, 37 years old, operations manager for Sunstate. His boots were spotless. His pressed shirt still carried the crease from the dry cleaner. He looked more like a banker than someone who worked around fruit. Richard surveyed the mountain of decaying bananas with obvious satisfaction. He noticed Emma standing beside her father's John Deere. Then he smiled. "I suppose this changes your mind about selling." Emma didn't answer. She kept watching the flies circle above the pile. Richard chuckled loudly enough for the gathered neighbors to hear. "You can't farm on that anymore." A few workers laughed with him. One even shook his head and muttered, "Poor kid." Richard folded his arms. Nature doesn't forgive mistakes this big. The laughter spread. Emma finally looked at him. Her expression never changed. She walked toward the nearest pile, knelt down, and picked up a handful of dark, fermenting banana pulp. She squeezed it gently between her fingers. The crowd watched in silence. "What are you doing?" Richard asked. Emma smelled the fruit. Then she smiled. Not because she was happy, because she remembered something her father had taught her years before while spreading compost beneath their oldest citrus trees. "Nothing in nature," he'd once said, "stays waste forever." She let the pulp fall back to the ground. "It isn't dead," she said quietly. It just hasn't finished becoming something else. Richard laughed again, this time even louder. Nobody else did. The old tractor sat behind Emma in the fading afternoon light, its chip green paint glowing beneath a layer of dust, as if waiting for someone to ask it to work one more impossible job. None of the people gathered along the fence realized that the mountain everyone called a disaster was about to become the most valuable thing that had ever happened to Carter family farms. And by the following spring, the factory itself would be sending people back to the very land they had tried to bury. The next morning, the smell reached downtown Frostproof. By sunrise, local radio stations were already talking about the banana farm disaster. Pickup trucks slowed along County Road 630 just to catch a glimpse of the steaming mountain. Some drivers rolled up their windows. Others laughed before driving away. Emma ignored all of them. She was standing beside her father's 1968 John Deere 3020, checking the engine oil the same way she had every Saturday since she was 16. Routine mattered, especially when everything else had fallen apart. The tractor started on the second turn of the key. Its four-cylinder diesel settled into the familiar rumble that echoed across the grove. For a moment, the smell of old diesel almost covered the stench of rotten fruit. Almost. That afternoon, the county environmental office arrived. Inspectors walked around the piles taking photographs and collecting samples. One warned Emma that the runoff could become a serious problem if heavy rain arrived before the waste was managed. "Can you remove it?" one inspector asked. Emma looked across nearly 900 tons of decaying bananas and quietly smiled. "Not remove it." "Then what?" "I'm going to use it." The inspector blinked. He wrote something in his notebook. He clearly believed she was in shock. "Let me tell you about Harold Bennett." Harold was 78 years old and owned the neighboring cattle farm. His knees hurt every winter. His hearing wasn't what it used to be, but he'd been building compost piles since long before people started calling it sustainable agriculture. When he heard what happened, he didn't bring sympathy. He brought a shovel. "You remember what your father always said?" Harold asked. Emma nodded. "Feed the soil before you feed the crop." Harold smiled. "Good, because right now you've got enough organic matter to feed this land for years." Emma looked toward the Black Mountain. "Everyone else thinks it's ruined." Harold pushed the shovel into the soft pile. "They're looking at fruit." He lifted a steaming scoop. "I'm looking at carbon, potassium, and life." For the next several days, the old John Deere worked harder than it had in years. Emma attached a weathered New Idea manure spreader, purchased by her grandfather in 1965, and began hauling load after load across exhausted sections of the farm. People thought she'd lost her mind. The work was miserable. Every bucket attracted thousands of flies. The Florida heat turned the banana piles into steaming hills that seemed to breathe. Her boots sank ankle deep with every step. By sunset, her clothes smelled like fermentation. She kept working. Richard Coleman returned 3 days later. This time he wasn't alone. 2 company executives stepped out beside him. One pointed toward Emma, driving slowly across the field. Another laughed. Richard shook his head. "I told you." They watched the spreader throw dark compost across the sandy soil. One executive smirked. "She's fertilizing dead ground." Richard folded his arms. "She'll give up by October." The men laughed together, not cruelly, confidently, the kind of laugh people make when they're absolutely certain the future belongs to them. Emma drove past without slowing. She tipped her cap, then continued spreading. She never looked back, for reasons none of them understood. That silence bothered Richard far more than an argument would have. Have you ever been surrounded by people who insisted something was impossible, while a small voice inside you kept saying they were wrong? That feeling can be lonely, but history has a strange habit of rewarding the people willing to wait longer than everyone else's confidence. Emma wasn't betting on luck. She was betting on biology. Here's something most people never realize. Fresh fruit isn't valuable because it's fruit. It's valuable because it's packed with nutrients that plants originally pulled from the soil. When fruit rots, those nutrients don't disappear. Microorganisms begin breaking everything apart. Bacteria and fungi convert the soft tissue into stable organic matter. Earthworms and insects join the process. Given enough oxygen and enough time, What looked like waste becomes one of nature's richest soil builders. The smell tells you decomposition is happening. It doesn't tell you the land is dying. Quite the opposite. Healthy soil begins with millions of tiny living organisms doing invisible work beneath your feet. Harold understood that decades before scientists made it fashionable. So had Emma's father. Now Emma understood it too. September slowly became October. The flies began disappearing. The towering piles shrank week after week. Steam no longer rose every morning. Instead, the ground underneath became darker than any soil on the property. Harold noticed it first. "Soil's changing," he whispered. Emma knelt and picked up a handful. It crumbled softly between her fingers. It no longer smelled rotten. It smelled alive. Richard wasn't laughing anymore. He drove past the farm twice that week, then 3 times. Finally, he parked along the fence and watched in silence. The black mountain was disappearing. Not because it had been hauled away, because the land itself was absorbing it. For the first time since the dumping began, Richard wondered whether he'd misunderstood something important. Then, 3 days later, after the season's first heavy rain swept across Polk County, something emerged from the compost-covered field that stopped every passing driver in their tracks. By dawn, the rain had stopped. Mist drifted low across the fields as sunlight crept over the citrus groves surrounding Carter family farms. Emma pulled on her worn leather gloves, walked through the gate, and froze. The field didn't look buried anymore. It looked different. Tiny green shoots had begun pushing through the dark compost. Not weeds. Cover crops she had planted 3 weeks earlier. Every seed that neighbors insisted would rot beneath the banana waste had germinated. And not just germinated. They were thriving. The leaves were darker, the stems thicker. The soil beneath them stayed cool and moist even after several warm afternoons. Emma knelt and scooped up a handful of earth. It broke apart like chocolate cake. Soft, crumbly, alive. Harold Bennett arrived just after sunrise. He crouched beside her without saying a word. After nearly a minute, he smiled. "I've waited 50 years to see compost this rich." Emma laughed softly. "So we're not crazy." Harold chuckled. "Oh, people will still call us crazy." He looked across the field. "But they'll stop laughing." Over the following month, the transformation became impossible to ignore. Earthworms appeared by the hundreds. Butterflies returned. The irrigation system needed less water because the soil finally held moisture instead of letting it disappear into Florida's sandy ground. Even neighboring farmers noticed. One stopped at the fence. "What did you put out here?" Emma simply answered, "Patience." Let me tell you about Emma's father. David Carter believed every farm kept a memory. Not in the buildings, not in the fences, in the soil. When Emma was 12 years old, she complained about spending weekends spreading compost instead of going to the lake with friends. Her father smiled. "Healthy ground remembers every good decision you make." At the time, she thought it sounded like poetry. Now she understood it was science. Every load of organic matter fed millions of invisible organisms. Those organisms built healthier soil. Healthier soil built stronger plants. Stronger plants survived drought. Simple, powerful, timeless. Word spread quickly across Polk County. The local newspaper published photographs comparing the field before and after the dumping. Then a regional television station arrived. Their headline surprised everyone. "Farm buried in waste shows unexpected recovery." People who had laughed only weeks earlier began driving out just to see the field themselves. Some apologized. Others simply stared. Richard Coleman came almost every evening after work. He parked beside the road, without introducing himself. He watched Emma work. He noticed she never hurried, never complained, never gloated. She simply kept farming. The confidence he once admired in himself suddenly looked very different beside her quiet determination. Have you ever discovered that the person you underestimated understood something you never bothered to learn? That realization can be uncomfortable. It can also change your life. Richard was beginning to understand that lesson. One afternoon, he finally walked across the field. Emma looked up from repairing an irrigation valve. "I suppose you're here to see if I'm still losing." Richard hesitated. "I think." He stopped, then started again. "I think I owe you an apology." Emma waited. "I laughed." "You did." I honestly believed this place was finished. Emma brushed dirt from her hands. So did almost everyone. Richard looked around the field. Rows of healthy plants stretched across ground he had declared dead only a month earlier. I've managed to produce plants for 12 years. He shook his head. I've never actually learned much about soil. Harold, tightening a bolt on the old manure spreader nearby, couldn't resist smiling. Most folks learn the hard way. Richard laughed quietly, this time at himself. The County Agricultural Extension Office requested soil samples. Laboratory reports arrived 2 weeks later. Organic matter had increased dramatically. Microbial activity was several times higher than neighboring fields. Water retention had improved. Nutrient levels had climbed. The results surprised even university specialists. What looked like an environmental disaster had become one of the richest natural compost applications anyone in the county had documented. Reporters returned. This time they weren't looking for failure. They wanted answers. Emma gave the same one every interview. I didn't invent anything. She smiled. I just trusted the land to finish the work. Richard requested a meeting with Sunstate Fruit Processing's executives. The conference room stayed silent as he laid photographs across the table. Before, after, healthy fields, laboratory reports, yield projections. One executive frowned. Are you telling us we accidentally improved her farm? Richard answered honestly. Yes. Another executive leaned back in disbelief. We spent nearly $40,000 hauling that waste. Richard nodded. And we probably increased the value of her property by more than that. Nobody laughed. Not one person. Outside, Emma climbed onto the John Deere once again. The old diesel engine came alive with its familiar rumble. She drove slowly across fields that only 6 weeks earlier had been buried beneath a mountain of rotting bananas. Children waved as she passed. Neighbors who once predicted failure now stopped to ask for advice. Harold watched from the fence. Your father would have enjoyed this. Emma smiled toward the horizon. I think he already has. The autumn sun settled low over Polk County, painting the transformed fields in shades of gold and green. But neither Emma nor Richard knew that the greatest surprise wasn't the restored soil, the newspaper headlines, or the public apologies. It was the harvest waiting just beyond the next growing season, one that would force the very factory that tried to bury her farm to stand in line at her gate. Spring arrived early in 1999. Warm mornings settled over Polk County, and Carter family farms looked nothing like it had 8 months earlier. Where reporters had once photographed mountains of black, rotting bananas, neat rows of healthy banana plants stretched toward the Florida sun. Between them grew cover crops that protected the soil and held moisture through the warmer weeks. Birds had returned. Earthworms filled the dark earth beneath every row. The land was alive again, more alive than anyone could remember. Emma walked the fields every morning before sunrise, carrying the same notebook her father had used for nearly 20 years. She recorded rainfall, soil moisture, temperatures, and observations about every section of the farm. The numbers amazed her. The banana plants were growing faster. The leaves were broader. Even during dry weeks, the soil stayed damp beneath the surface because the rich organic matter acted like a sponge. Neighbors who had laughed the previous autumn now asked where she had bought fertilizer. Emma smiled. I didn't buy it. Let me tell you about old farmers. The best ones rarely claim to know everything. Instead, they spent their lives watching the weather, watching insects, watching the soil. They understood that farming wasn't about controlling nature. It was about cooperating with it. Emma finally understood why her father had spent so much time simply walking the fields. He wasn't wasting time. He was listening. Harvest season arrived in July. The first truckload left Carter family farms before sunrise. Then another. Then another. The yield surprised everyone. Production was nearly 30% higher than the farm's average from previous years. The fruit graded beautifully. Even buyers from Tampa noticed the difference. Within weeks, Emma had more purchase requests than she could immediately fill. One afternoon, a familiar white pickup rolled slowly into the driveway. Richard Coleman stepped out. This time there was no confidence in his stride, only humility. He removed his cap before speaking. I owe you more than an apology. Emma leaned against the old John Deere. You already apologized. Not enough. He looked across the fields. Our company made a terrible decision. Emma waited quietly. Richard continued. We thought we were burying your future. He smiled faintly. We ended up financing it. For the first time since they met, both of them laughed. Not because anyone had won, because both of them had learned. Richard explained that Sunstate Fruit Processing wanted to purchase fruit from Carter Family Farms under a long-term supply agreement. Emma looked surprised. The same company. The same company. She considered the offer for several moments, then extended her hand. On one condition. Richard nodded. Name it. No shortcuts. He smiled. No shortcuts. They shook hands. The old 1968 John Deere 3020 never retired. Every winter Emma serviced it exactly the way her father had taught her. Fresh oil. New filters. Grease every fitting. Check every hose. Replace only what truly needed replacing. Visitors often asked why she never traded it for something newer. She always gave the same answer. Because this one still keeps its promises. The tractor became something of a local landmark. School groups visiting nearby farms always wanted to see the tractor that survived the Banana Mountain. Emma never corrected them. She simply let children climb into the seat while she told them stories about their grandparents' generation and the importance of caring for both machines and land. 5 years passed, then 10. By 2009, Carter Family Farms had become one of the county's most respected small farms. Emma expanded carefully, never borrowing more than she could repay. She taught workshops on composting and soil restoration. Farmers from across Central Florida visited to learn practical techniques for rebuilding exhausted land. Richard often attended those meetings, not as an executive, as a student. He openly admitted the mistake his company had made and encouraged younger managers never to confuse confidence with wisdom. His honesty earned respect that success alone never could. Harold Bennett lived long enough to see the farm flourish. Before he passed away peacefully at the age of 89, he walked the fields one last time beside Emma. He smiled toward the dark, healthy soil. I told you people would stop laughing. Emma squeezed his hand. They did. Years later, when visitors asked about the famous banana story, Emma rarely talked about the factory. She talked about the land. She talked about her father. She talked about Harold. She talked about patience. The mountain of rotten bananas had disappeared decades earlier, but its lesson remained beneath every footstep, invisible, working quietly, just like the countless organisms beneath the soil that never asked for recognition. Some people remembered the lawsuit that followed. Others remembered the newspaper headlines. Emma remembered something much simpler. The morning she picked up a handful of rotting fruit and chose hope instead of anger. Because sometimes the difference between disaster and opportunity is simply knowing what you're really looking at. The land remembers every kindness you give it, and sooner or later, it finds a way to return the favor. If this story reminded you of someone who refused to give up when everyone else had already written them off, I'd love to hear about them in the comments. Maybe it was a parent, a grandparent, a neighbor, or even you. These stories deserve to be remembered because they're part of the quiet history that built rural America. And next time, I'll tell you about the farmer who bought an abandoned peach orchard for almost nothing, only to discover that the oldest trees everyone wanted to cut down were hiding a secret that changed the entire valley. I hope you'll join me for that story.